Thank you. Thank you very much for the kind introduction, and it's a real pleasure for me to be here. So the pleasure is all on my side. So actually, when I got this kind of freedom to pick a topic I would like to talk about, I thought I would like to talk about something I'm struggling right with. I'm writing a book on... Was that the veto? Should I write another book? Of course, I am free to change my subject. If technology has anything against that book. It's what's not the voting booths where you say, no, not about that. Okay, so what I will give you an idea throughout my talk about what I'm currently working on. And I picked the title Academic Lineups, and you will see why I call it like that, on lifelines, timelines, and trajectories towards the future.
Maybe this will work.
Thank you. But this was not switched on, maybe. Maybe it just didn't work because it wasn't switched on.
No, it is.
That's always the first explanation for the physicist. Switch it on.
Okay, go on.
It's okay, you hear me? Okay, great. So when you visit the literature in the social sciences over the past years, you have seen an upcoming theme around acceleration and around something that is often called the culture of speed. And a lot of analysis has been gravitating around this idea of speed becoming the defining characteristics of contemporary societies. This trend is echoed also in the fields in academic debates, but also in debates on academia, that there is a problem with it. We feel a feeling of a growing pressure with a worrisome degree of alienation of people from their professions, in a sense, is something we have to address and to deal with. And it's quite interesting to just have to battle. Okay, so some of the answers come up with this idea of to slow down. So as like with slow food, you have now slow professors, and I said I incorporate right now the slow professor because I can only walk with a crutch. But that's probably not what is understood as the slow professor. But to kind of take out this kind of paradigm of speed out of the academic idea. But I pinpointed this advertisement for the slow professor, and I attract your attention to the publicity that is next to it. It says, "Impact tomorrow." And I took this picture because it shows very nicely this schizophrenic relationship we have with these discussions. That on the one hand, we are kind of in love with this better, faster, higher, and on the other hand, we kind of have the feeling that it's going in the wrong direction. There's something that is not working the way it should. And I think this incorporates that. I also give you a second example. It's about efficiency talk. This is a publicity I took from University of Cornell in the US. And it says, "Give us 5 minutes, we'll save you an hour." And if you look at these kind of discursive constructions, and this whole idea that it's all about managing your time better, and that will save everything you're doing wrong, then you will see that there is a more profound problem in our understanding of how knowledge creation and time kind of go together. Now, this is embedded in a wider imagination of what kinds of societies we inhabit. Where does that come from? And it comes from two kinds of diagnosis, I think, that are interesting. The one is innovation society. So the new and the discourses on emerging technosciences are at the core of how we imagine future developments. So we always think innovation will be the solution to any of the problems we have. And if you look at the way how we digitalize and think about new workplaces, etc., many of the problems are said, oh, we will solve that. Artificial intelligence, computerization, digitalization, they will solve our problems. They will not solve our problems, they will just create others. They will maybe solve some and create new ones. Okay, and the second part is actually that we live in something one could call a self-experimental society, that this expresses our willingness as citizens, as researchers, at whatever we are in our roles, to or to be open to, or even to embrace all kinds of new forms of experiences, and that is expected from all of us. So if you do not buy into technological innovation, you're seen as backwardedness, as somebody that is not embracing the future, as somebody that might hinder society to develop. So you're seen as an element of a problematic element in this society. So coming from an STS background, I do not only believe that science and technology shape society, but I also think that society shapes the way how we do science and technology. So then this becomes an important question, like if we believe and we follow the idea that innovation is the solution and that self-experimentation we need to be ready at any price, then we also shape our contemporary academic research cultures accordingly, because they are meant to create the next generation of researchers and of citizens, not only of researchers, and of citizens that behave in a way that embrace these kinds of changes. Now, from there, I do think it is important to look at these transformations of academic research through the lens of time, and to embrace this kind of time-sensitive approach when studying academia, and not to look at time, as Barbara Adam pointed us to, as a deep structure of the taken for granted, unquestioned assumptions. So it is this obligation to start to question the temporalization of the way we do academic research and we live as academics, and how we imagine innovation to come about. But then I would like not so much to focus on acceleration and to think about God, the speed kills us all and we can't do this and that. And I do not want to engage with this strong dichotomy between slow and fast, because I don't think that's the point. Because that might make us overlook how much more complex structures are underlying these distinctions of fast and slow. And in that sense, I think, and that's what I'm after in my studies, I feel that acceleration might actually be understood as an outcome and not as a phenomenon in itself, as an outcome of a gradual process of reconfiguring the temporal infrastructures of academic work and life. And of course, this is embedded in wider societal structures, but I'm now looking at the academic structures of temporal infrastructures of life and work. So to shift our attention to the places and moments where time gets made, and this is already the central thing, there is not time. It's not a physical entity I'm after. I'm looking at how time is made, and to investigate how different temporalities are intertwined in these academic environments. My wider interest, and that's where the computer protested before, is about something I call the chronopolitics, a notion that has been used by Virilio or by Dick Pelz in their work, a chronopolitics of contemporary academic research, so the politics of time. I want to understand the multiple temporal dimensions that explicitly and implicitly shape individual and collective lives in research. So I want to analyze what kind of, by whom, and how temporalities are produced. And this can be through structural, but also through discursive kind of interventions. And I'm interested in how, when, and for whom they get assembled in specific ways, because there is not the sole temporality that guides research. That's why speed alone or acceleration alone is not sufficiently describing what's actually happening to us. And in that sense, I find it quite interesting. So I'm interested in what I call the choreographies, the temporal choreographies. So how do people actually mend together these different demands of time? How do they individually perform these different things? So there is some guidance, like in a choreography, like in a ballet, but you have the dancer, and the individuum is the dancer in that sense, that has to find a way to kind of comply to the multiple demands that he gets on the way he is supposed to express what the story is about and what the choreographer wants from her or from him, etc. And in that sense, I think if we take science as a culture, so to understand as an epistemic and a social environment, I think it's quite nice to use Jeremy Rifkin's notion of the temporal fingerprint, where he says every culture has its unique set of temporal fingerprints, and to think, what are the unique sets of temporal fingerprints science has actually, if we treat it as a culture, as a way of living and producing knowledge. Now, taken from there, I'm then, as I said, I see choreographies are always situated, and they are flexible in character. Whoever likes to go to the ballet will know that it depends on the dancer. If you go to see Schwanensee, you can see 5 different versions of Schwanensee. I'm not comparing science to Schwanensee necessarily, but that is the kind of metaphor why I think it's about this fluidity that is always inside, that depends on people and how they feel they can arrange these things. So I want to investigate the complex dynamics of how researchers work with, for, but also against temporal orders. And we all have our strategies to kind of push that. And to think about the deep ambivalence that brings, because we on the one hand draw pleasure and liberating and have feeling of liberation when we arrive first, when we get some kind of special kind of attention for something. Then time and speed and being first becomes something very positive, while it can be something very disturbing on another level. So be always aware of this ambivalence. So it's not about a good story of the past and a bad story of the future, but it's a more complicated story about how ambivalent we feel about these things. And we can reflect on what this means for how we can know who stays in research, because that's an essential question, what value regimes can be established. Now, in my work, and I will very shortly only tip into that, but I wanted to mention it. In my work, and this is something I've been following over several projects where I looked into the lives of researchers, and I'm working with something like 150 or 60 even long interviews of 2 to 3 hours with researchers in different areas, mostly in the natural sciences, but also a bit in the social sciences and in interdisciplinary fields, where I extract this kind of reflection from. And so in one of these European projects, I've been studying how people describe their living environments in research. And out of that, I have been developing the notion of epistemic living spaces, because actually people use a lot of spatial metaphors to describe their being in research, like how much room for maneuver do they have, how much space they have to bring people in, or how secure is their space, they can move, etc. So they have a lot of stories about space. So I developed that, and actually the temporal dimension that makes space and time always hang together is an interesting facet in it. So I'm working with this notion. It's a bottom-up notion which I created out of researchers' narratives in order to describe actually what they are after. They want to describe an environment that is sufficiently open for them and structured and stable in order for them to live in it. It's a narrative concept in the sense of its space is never something that is just given, but it's something that is created through the narrative itself. So space is less the already existing setting from which, for such stories, much rather it is the production of space through the act of narration. So this way of conceptualizing where you are and how you stand. And the second is actually there are a lot of interesting stuff around narratives and organizations like Czarniawska and other people who have written on that. So I'm kind of tapping into that. And for my own work, I'm working and I'm developing the concept of narrative infrastructures. So to think about what are the kind of sub-narratives and parts of narrative people can use to speak about their work and their working conditions and things like that. So I want to understand the temporal narrative infrastructures that people have. So about what can you not speak? So why does everybody, when you ask him, say, I'm totally stressed out, I have no time? Why would never anybody admit that he or she leisurely read 2 books? This is just somebody nobody tells you, even if they did so. They would always add something because being out of time and having no time is a sign of success. So at least you have to perform the total haste and being out of time. So that's what I mean why I think there's an infrastructure there that guides you to tell stories in a specific way and not differently. It disciplines you. And I'm also interested in more the imaginary. So how do people actually imagine where to be? And how is science in the academic environment able to produce that? And there I use Jasanov's socio-technical or socio-scientific, I would say, imaginaries. So what are the shared ideas communities hold of how the future should come out by developing certain kinds of knowledge, etc.? And you can reflect on your own community you're in and how the knowledge you are producing tries to make certain achievements possible, etc. Okay, so, and finally that brings me together, oops, I'm sorry, I'm kind of struggling. So this epistemic living space is then embedded in broader policy narratives, in wider societal expectations and regimes of valuation, so how value is attributed, and that is super different than it was maybe when I studied 30 years or 40 years ago, but one doesn't say that, some decades ago. So this idea of relevance and immediacy of relevance, etc., is something that is very specific for the now and hasn't been around when I was studying. That's something that was never on the agenda. So, but then we have, on the one hand, a huge narrative cluster which can be grouped about this new public management talk, which is about indicator-driven evaluation, efficiency, and the value of innovation. And the of is important here. So what it is, we want to produce auditable work, so work that can be counted by some, and I'm sure the Portuguese science policymakers are not different than the rest of Europe. So they also like these counting and accounting exercises very much. That gives them the insurance, for whatever reasons they need it, that we are on the right track, whatever the right track is, but we think we are on it. And so we can speak about academic entrepreneurship, and we have this notion of academic capitalisms and things like that. But on the other hand, you also have a rising demand for more engagement with society. So we are asked to address ethical issues, values, and concerns, and so we are asked to do more reflexive work. And so we are asked to perform something one could call in the literature, very often it's called academic citizenship. And on the other hand, on the third is we have well-entrenched valuation practices and orders of worth, which we kind of have. We have academic rituals, we have myths about research and about being a good academic researcher. And even though this becomes a golden past narrative where everything was better than it is now, it matters. So I'm not saying that this is the true story and the other ones are, but I'm saying these are the kind of discursive environment in which the epistemic living space of the single researcher, that single researcher can develop an idea, what is the space he or she has to develop. Good, so that is just, and of course they interact with each other, and in other writings I've been thinking about how the strength of new public management actually turns this demand for reflection in a ritual. Very often it becomes ritualized. Let's do at the end of the project some outreach, or let's do quickly something on this and that because we have to do it. So we kind of ritualize this kind of work. Okay, now as I said, we speak of time spaces in the sense of Barbara Adams' timescapes is a perfect notion for that, and I was very much inspired by her writing in that sense. And I think what she nicely points to, that the scape part of the concept acknowledges what we cannot embrace time without simultaneously encompassing space and matter. That is, without embodiment in a specific and unique context. And a timescape perspective then allows to bring together spatiality, materiality, and contextuality, but it foregrounds the temporal feature of it in that sense. So in a sense, I think it in an analogy to the landscape in the way, and I will need this analogy at the end, it allows us to be attentive to the simultaneous superposition and fusion of physical elements, of cultural dispositions, and of personal perceptions. If I like a landscape or not, this is not something about the physical arrangement. This is about me having a particular kind of emotional aesthetic and other things. So timescapes are always also tied to a perceptual category, to people. And it's very important in that sense of, in the sense of sense making and the creation of shared meaning. Now, if you want to study academia, according to time, I said time is made. So who makes time and how is time made, etc. So for that, I kind of came across a notion which triggered my thinking, and that is Rindersbacher's notion of time generators. And a time generator is nothing more than a key site which creates binding temporal requirements and regulations. And as we will see, we witness a multiplication of time generators through the uncoordinated introduction of ever new temporal requirements. So evaluations, when you submit a paper, your career steps, the impact factors. The impact factor is a time construct because it says something about the number of citations in a very specific windows of time. So if it's low, it tells something about the temporality of a field and not necessarily of the quality of a field. So it's quite interesting to think about how these things are all, and they're all introduced by different people, by different structures, by different institutions. So they don't necessarily neither think about each other, nor know from each other, or think about it carefully, or nor know about it. So that is the interesting thing. So we have a multiplication of time generators within institutions like a university. And once you start to study that, you realize it's not one big force that is there, but it's about a kind of general idea that it is translated in different places in different ways, and that creates a very strange kind of outcome. Now, time generators, I give you a totally absurd example of a time generator that is a non-academic one, and that's one of my favorite examples, and that's the following one. This is the Olympics 2016, swimming, and the measurement system allows for a precision up to 1/1,000,000th of a second. But actually, the error of the basin in which they swim is orders of magnitude bigger than the time difference that you can measure. So it's fully absurd to measure a millionth of a second, because it depends on which lane you were swimming and whether or not that is meaningful. And sometimes I think this has a wonderful parallel. Sport always likes to compare with, science likes to compare with a fair competition of sport. So let me also compare the fair measuring of quality. That's roughly that. So we measure something that has a bigger error of measuring than with the kind of tools we measure it. And I think this kind of, when I saw it, I knew I have to take that as an example because it is so strikingly absurd. But we nevertheless love to have a first one. And we are ready to go for it. And nobody complains. None of these guys that swim in there, they just take it as much as academics take it, that this is the way we do it. So just to say there are others that serve the same kind of, oops, sorry, I'm struggling with that. Okay, and finally we have to think about how we represent time. And Hackett has taught us that representation is always intervention. There is nothing like an innocent representation, and when you look at how time is represented, we have lines, arrows, sequences, calendars, graphs showing the temporal developments. And I think it's very important to think about how time gets visualized and how we keep time and how we structure that. So, and there's a beautiful book on the history of timelines, and if you have time to look at that, I'm sorry, you cannot say time anymore when you work on time. When you have time to look at it, it's a very beautiful book by Graf Planet, Anthony and Daniel Rosenberg, who look at the history of temporal productions, and they very nicely show how the timeline seems among the most inescapable metaphors we have in contemporary society. So the line, that's why I chose also the topic of the lines. In that sense, this kind of linearity is an expression of order, which is not necessarily the only order we could have, but it has become this kind of dominant expression. And this is a nice example of it. This is just one example. So per capita energy consumption, the rise of the GDP, the expenditure on research, we always like to produce these timelines because they seem, or they pretend, or we think they tell us something about us and about the future we are going to. And this is deeply ingrained in our culture, that we cannot strip that off. So we cannot live without them. And so even if they have become nonsensical, we keep them alive, because if we break them, we have no past. And how would we know about our future if we abandon the reconstruction of our past? So this is really, really deeply ingrained. Let me get to the core of what I want to show you, namely 3 kinds of lines and their interconnectedness. I want to speak about timelines of epistemic work, so the organized ways of doing research through projects. The second is lifelines, investigate the narratives of careers and human development in research. And thirdly, to look into trajectories, how we connect past, present, and future in research. Now, oops, I'm unteachable apparently, my finger actually is unteachable. So now, we seem to think that the project is the only rational way to organize research. But then we tend to forget that the project is an invention of the 20th century and has really only widely entered science from the 70s onward. Most European countries did not have science funds before that time, and so no project distribution of money. And if you did good research, you would get the money from your university and you would have a reasonable amount of staff, and you would kind of continue to do your research. Now, the project has actually become the core time generator, I would put forward, in contemporary research. The colonization of research by project-related principles, rules, techniques, and procedures aspiring to form a new iron cage of project rationality is actually a very nice description of what we have seen emerge over the last 20 to 30 years. So we now start to speak, when we speak about research, we speak of roadmaps and milestones, of deadlines. They become the kind of key notions. But we also start to think in equivalences of knowledge and time. Reflect just the notion of the full-time equivalent. What does this mean? How could I think for a second that my knowledge can be equalized in some way in something that is a full-time equivalent that has nothing to do with any human? It has to do something with time, actually, with 40 hours a week, as if one could capture knowledge-making through this kind of easy equation. But we all do it. I inclusive, I write, I need so and so many full-time equivalents, and then I think, like, I hope that works out for how many people could I hire for that? Okay, half-time, no, 3/4 of a time, maybe. I think I don't need to tell you more about that. And we move from an exploratory learning to an exploitative learning. Learning has become something that needs to have this kind of touch-on quality, like you have to produce something. It cannot be just learning as an exploration. It needs to be learning as a product at the end of the day. And so we have this more narrative in that sense. So we have, whoa, look, my finger does this. More researchers, more funding, more publications, more innovations. Where does the time come from? More time to do what? In which ways, etc., etc. So I think this is a story to be asked, because this brings along, this idea of growth brings along planning and accounting. It comes hand in hand with it. And these 2 pictures, very nicely, the first one is taken out of a video from the European Union. And this is the launch video of Horizon 2020. And the launch video shows this sole guy, which he's called the innovator. The innovator, and these light bulbs are his ideas. They fall from the ceiling, so just pay attention to be in the right spot, that the idea falls on you. But at the backdrop, you might not see it so well, you have a graph that goes up. So again, we have this idea narrative of growth. More ideas, growth. Or you have this beautiful poster, Innovate or Die, where you have to keep the earth moving by our physical force. So efficiency, relevance, and excellence become these key underlying values that are supposed to drive us and to not make us move away from it. And that's why we are so happy with academic entrepreneurship and capitalism in that sense. So people knowing how to move the systems and how to move in the systems. And we have a narrative of growth and this idea that innovations need to flow. But we have never asked ourselves, what are the units of production? If you just look at the articles, yeah, you can always make 3 articles out of one. That is not a problem. Any intelligent person can do that. The question is like, who gains from that? You don't know more, you have more evaluators, more time is needed, you have more higher rejection rates, etc., etc. So the question is like, what is feeding the idea? But don't underestimate, excellence needs selection. So if we would have an excellence that said 30% would get the money, and that's excellent, everybody would say, that's not excellent. 8% get it, then that's excellent. So we produce the kinds of structures ourselves by buying into particular kinds of automatized logics, which is not the plaidoyer that we should not look for quality. I'm not saying that, that is not my message. The message is to say, do we do the right things to look for quality? So that is, I think, an important thing to return. And I find this cartoon nicely captures it. This is not only for science. So scientists say, how many citations do we have? The journalist says, how many page views did we get? And the politician says, what is the public mood? So we have moved into this kind of self-observing modality where we kind of count the impact we have in the world. And that becomes the only way how we see whether or not we make a difference or not. Okay, now I've showed what the project does in a way and how it temporalizes the way we work and think. And of course I could say much about the epistemology that brings along. Never ask a question that cannot be answered in 3 years. That's the learning. Or pretend that you do not ask a question that can be answered or do whatever you want. To get the project, don't ask a question that cannot be done in 3 years. That does something to our way of thinking. It impacts us, whether we want it or not. And even if we cleverly tell the story how well we are in moving through different landscape by having one project that covers the other, I have this story also myself. It just means that you have to do extra work to align these things, and you always run the risk that it doesn't align. And so the question is like, how does your engagement start to look like when you do this kind of work? Now let me move to the lifelines, which are the second line, I think. So we have the project brought about different kinds of lifelines, and generally we do not connect that to projectification, but we should actually. The shift in the relation between different kinds of workforce. And Ilyoki and others have, Finnish researcher, they have very nicely elaborated on this projectification and how that changes people's lives, in a sense. So we have an emergence of a whole new category of researchers who temporarily join the academic institutions as project collaborators, and they sell their labor through the tool of project time. So you get paid because there is project, you are this full-time equivalent person thing at the end of the day. So what we see then is a delegation of the experimental work on project to trainees, coupled with a change in the use of the reward system in science. So you have this hugely co-authored paper that appear because the work gets distributed over different kinds of groups of people. And so you have this idea that by that you multiply the time of the project leader, which of course is a partial illusion because the project leader is not an indefinitely multipliable entity, and that causes quite a number of debates within the life sciences, for example, what that means if somebody supervises 30 PhD students, and that is that all work on different projects. It's like so what we have is a kind of industrialization of the workforce and a temporalization of the workforce. And that brings about the whole debate we have about precarity, about temporal contracts. And the end effect is the speeding up of products, and as was with industrialization, the idea was to produce more, whatever you produce, and to have an educated workforce. So in the beginning, a lot of biologists said actually PhD students do now what the technicians did before. So you have a shift in the kind of education. So planning has to be done. So to do the right things at the right time, and that becomes a kind of core mantra. You cannot fail. You have to have always the right things together in order to move on. And controlling researchers' temporal resources, as well as the regulation of rhythms, duration, speed, sequences, and the synchronization of events and activities must be understood as an expression of power. And so we have a new power structure that gets into the research system that comes with the projectification, but that is not obviously visible and it's because it's over the control of time that you exercise power over people. So the career, the idea of the career, and I will immediately explain the counterpart to the career, creates a temporal subject that has to be trajectorized and well-timed. The academic life has to be trajectorized and well-timed. That is an ideal. And you have to anticipate to having done the right things at the right time, and it is the go up or out logic that is at work. Either you manage to move up, or you will move out, or will be moved out, or you move out. There are different versions of that story. So in that sense, we develop new kinds of career practices, namely the demand to develop specific representational practices. And I have been as evaluator on the ERC for many years, and I was amazed. So this is a selection of people who really think of themselves as being capable to pull off these excellence grants. And it's fascinating to see how, on the one hand, they have longer time because they have children, but they try to wipe out the fact that they have children from the academic lineup. So you would not be able to time the children, and I found that very interesting because it impacts lives in an interesting way. But you have to show that you're continuously performing nevertheless. So that is, so this kind of continuity creation is an interesting phenomenon that we see with CVs. You always have to be ready to go on to a different place on the job market. And interruption is not something that is very much kind of appreciated, even though some people tell you that it is. It depends very much on the kind of interruption, and not every interruption counts, and you never know when and where the interruption counts. And the second part, which I find so important, are these particular kinds of waiting games that we have started to play. And there's a beautiful body of literature on waiting. Bourdieu is one of them, but there are many others who look into this idea that making people wait, so a delaying without destroying hope, is part of the domination. And Bourdieu has really nice pieces on that. And I think with many of the young people that work in our institution, that's exactly what we do. It's an eternal waiting game. So to see maybe there will be a possibility. The maybe keeps many people alive until the maybe becomes probably not. And then you have really kind of saddening, I feel them personally saddening moments when you see the system has not kind of been able to speak out its temporalities in a clear manner. And of course we also have counter discourses like this one. Like, why doing a PhD is often a waste of time in The Economist, a long debate. And I took a picture, which is actually the right one, the cartoon is actually from the American immigration. And I think academic careers have a lot to do with American immigration. You never know what you will be asked, and you never know how it will get out, and what kinds of prejudices will be there at work when you are at the moment. So there is something we need to address as academics, to think about what are these stories and temporalities, while we need to motivate young people to get into science because we need them. But at the same time, we need to be open about these kinds of things. Now, I would like to make this distinction between career and biography, which I find so interesting. Etymologically, it's interesting, the word career is derived from the Latin carriera, and carros meaning the chariot and the predefined racing path. While biography appears in English in roughly its current version in 17th century, and it's a mixture of Greek and the bios meaning life and graphene meaning writing. And so the career is this kind of technologically structured kind of idea of the race, while the biography is this envy to become a person, a persona, a person that has a value and develops its own character. And so in the interviews, a lot of people speak, what I make this distinction, about the biographical moment and their hopes. Oh God, my fingers, I'm not capable to learn anymore. So the norms and the temporal logic of the career are actually the primary touchstones in contemporary research systems. It's staying in the game, being ahead of competition are the prime values, while the biographical ideas are generally postponed. Once I have arrived, once I've become associate professor, once I've become something. But only to realize that sometimes it has become an illusion, because once you're in that game, you are staying there, and this kind of big biographical idea sometimes becomes kind of a bit preempted, because you're so much, the machine needs to go on, it needs to be greased and need to run smoothly. And so many of the PIs, so the principal investigators who have definitely become a position now, they are quite amazed about that this is not the liberation from everything, but it's just something different. And they are still in the logic of what they were before. So I think that's a nice way to think about, do we want biographies, do we want careers, or what do we actually want? That brings me to my last, and I know I'm a bit over time already, but I'll do, okay, my finger. Good, the last one is the arrow of time, and how to relate the past and the future. The cultural and social anthropologist Laboratório, in his book on future, has very nicely pointed to the fact that trajectories is a specificity of modernity. And he says it's a deeper epistemological and ontological habit which always assumes that there is a cumulative journey from here to there, more exactly from now to then, in human affairs, as natural as the river and as all-encompassing as the sky. And there is a telos in it, and you have this whole narrative that you develop on trajectories. But it's much more complex, and he calls that one of the big pitfalls of modernity, into which we tap also as researchers very often, because we nicely want to bind these things into these orders. Also, oh God, also Bruno Latour in his last, no, it's not his last book, in one of his last books, An Inquiry into Modes of Existence, he comes back to his way of seeing we have never been modern, and he picks it up and he nicely says, also those people, no matter where they are born, who feel themselves pushed by time's arrow in such a way that behind them lies an archaic past, unhappily combining facts and values. And there is this future where we can separate facts and we can just live by these facts. And they will replace values in a sense, and we can have all these rational choosing and living, etc., etc. So he calls that the modernization front in that sense, and is kind of picking up this critique. That explains, to my view, wow, so successful, I hope you realize that. Otherwise it doesn't count, if nobody has seen it. Futuring and anticipation has become something extremely important. And even in these new concepts of responsibility, anticipation starts to matter a lot, in the sense that we need to think ahead, we need to plan, we need to anticipate. And there's increasing attention devoted to the practices of anticipation, transforming and controlling research futures. Harrington and co-authors call it a breathless futurology. Adams and Groves kind of capture it very nicely by the sentence, standing still means falling behind. So this idea that we have to move on. Our care for and intervention into developments, be they social, societal, or scientific, is no longer firmly situated in the now, but in the not yet. We have always to think about what is the next and not what is the yet. And this justifies our choices in the now. So it requests us to comply and to support these interventions in the now, be they in terms of supporting a specific development or acting in a way which seems adequate to avoid certain kinds of futures. So this has become also in academia very strongly. Many of our young people go to courses where they learn about how planning and management, etc. I find that fascinating, actually, to think that this is the way out. My learning is still not very... But you also have this kind of a posture of promising that comes along with that. And the picture is taken from an EMBO journal, where the whale is my research and the little mouse is others' research. So you always have to oversize the importance of your own research, and you undersize the importance of other people's. And there is a development, something of what we called in a report, economy of techno-scientific promises, because it's an economy in the sense that it's an exchange of promises in a way, and the better promises on the market, the better you have a chance to kind of rise. So we have a rising projectification and programmification, and with that also the promising practices grow and differentiate. And when you read project application, it's fabulous to read it under that guise, what people can promise you. It's fascinating to me. It's always kind of doing field work for me. So again, good. So, and then of course, and that I will quickly go over, you all know the mappings and rankings exercises that interestingly always the same come up as first, which has nothing to do with the criteria. I did not say that. It was just because they are the only good ones on this earth. So, but they are strongly used for orientation, and they become this kind of geography where people move in and think whether they are in the center or in the periphery and so on. And the pictures are taken from the higher education ranking, and they themselves are very interesting. So you go towards the light, and it's fabulous to look at the visual discourses that go along with that. I could not keep myself off doing that. So again, wrong. So that means at the end of the day that certain types of work are more valued than others. And you have to see that there is a balancing between career work and care work. And among other consequences, that produces interesting gender divides in research, which seems important to kind of keep. That's my end. I have two thoughts to give you, or two slides of thoughts to give along with you. Lineups are actually a very attractive idea in a logic of efficiency, of planning, efficiency and control. It's very attractive. Yet, a growing number of not necessarily synchronized time generators create temporal hyperfragmentation. So we have a very inefficient form of efficiency, in the sense that we produce incredibly amount of interrupted time, because it is always a different rhythm that comes. And so the sum of interrupted time entities is not the time. So it's not a full-time equivalent calculation. And if I have 3.5 hours a day, it's not the same than having 1.5 hours. So and this thinking in time generators and diversification fractures our time. So we live in a hyperfragmentation. We have a polyrhythmicity, and we can profit from Lefebvre's thinking about what that does to us as humans. And we have a huge amount of a feeling of asynchronicity. The rhythms of reporting and assessing of lives and careers in research, as well as of projects and publication cycles, do not necessarily fit together anymore. And then we can go forwards and think like that exclusion can be understood in terms of not being allowed to coordinate one's time with the systemic time, in which vital opportunities such as power, employment, and recognition are negotiated. And that's an interesting way to think about why women drop out, even though we have a lot of plans that foster to getting women into science. It's the question of, do they have the possibility to synchronize with certain ways of working and thinking, and how does that create exclusion? So time becomes the locus of social opportunities in that sense. And we have to think it as a kind of inclusion-exclusion thing. Okay, that's not. So sharing the idea that certain temporal routines are adequate or at least acceptable contributes actually a lot to the feeling of belonging. So having time structures that do not fit actually alienate people a lot, and that explains the complaints, the kind of complaint culture we witness, that a lot of people feel uneasy in the places they are, without obvious reasons sometimes, you think, and then you can think there might be other obvious reasons that you don't see immediately. We have to identify, therefore, and reflect where and when specific temporal narratives can successfully unfold and gain power. We have to think about who produces, distributes, and reproduces them, and many more. So we have to become more sensitive to the invisible temporal dimensions of life and the distribution of worth in academia. And think of it in terms of what in German you have the notion of Landschaft, which means landscape, and you have Landschaftspflege. This is a profession, somebody who takes care of a landscape, and I do think we need temporal care work there. So to better think about the different temporalities and how they go together, as much as a Landschaftsarchitect would look at the way how things go together in the landscape. And I end with Bruno Latour's quote, "We are actually exchangers and brewers of time. It is this exchange that defines us, not the calendar or the flow that the moderns had constructed for us." Thank you.